In the annals of history, few figures capture the imagination and human spirit like Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans. In the heart of 15th century France, an era marked by conflict and turmoil, her legend emerges, woven from valor and faith. A tale that defies the passage of time and barriers of disbelief. Joan, a young woman of humble origin, rose as a beacon of hope in a France torn apart by the 100 Years' War. A desperate struggle for supremacy that tested the soul of a nation. Joan's story is an amalgam of deep faith, mystical visions, and unbreakable courage. In the words of Georges Duby, a renowned medieval historian, Joan appeared in a moment of despair and became the symbol of French resistance against oppression. Armed with unshakable faith and iron determination, she led French troops to several significant victories, the most notable in Orleans, where her presence inspired a demoralized army to a surprising resistance against English forces. As noted by the contemporary chronicler Jean Chartier, she was a girl who feared not the most powerful armies. Her courage was such that it instilled bravery in those who heard her. However, Joan's glory was fleeting. Captured by Burgundian forces and handed over to the English, her trial for heresy became a dark chapter of political manipulation and religious fervor. In this trial, Joan's words resonate as a testament to her unbreakable spirit. "I committed myself to God, my Creator. I promised and swore to help maintain and defend the nation of France." Her conviction and subsequent execution at the stake at the tender age of 19 left an indelible mark on the soul of France, a wound that time has not completely healed. In the lap of the modest village of Domrémy, in northeastern France, a girl named Joan was born into a world torn by war and conflict. Daughter of Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romée, Joan grew up in a peasant family that, although humble in means, was rich in faith and family values. Life in Domrémy was marked by rustic simplicity. Fields stretching to the horizon, the Meuse River winding through the land, and the cycles of the seasons dictating the rhythm of daily life. As written by Régine Pernoud, an authority on Joan of Arc's history, it was a life marked by hard work and religious devotion, an environment in which the young Joan was shaped. 15th century France was a tapestry of uncertainty and turmoil, with the 100 Years' War leaving a scar on the landscape and the spirit of the people. The conflict between France and England, a duel of powers for control of French territories, had worn down the morale and resources of the nation. In this context, stories of battles and feats of knights and warriors were not foreign to Joan's ears, and her deeply rooted Christian faith was strengthened in an environment where the church was the community's pillar. It was in this setting of fervent faith and constant conflict where Joan began to experience her mystical visions. Around the age of 13, according to her own words at her trial, Joan began to hear voices. These were not ordinary voices, but, as she claimed, those of saints like Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, who imparted a divine mandate to expel the English from France and bring Charles VII to the throne. These visions not only guided her but also transformed her. Historian Marina Warner noted, "These mystical experiences shaped Joan's identity, giving her a determination and purpose that were beyond the ordinary." Joan's determination to heed this celestial call led her on a path of challenges and trials. Her journey to Chinon to meet with the Dauphin Charles is a testament to her audacity and unshakable faith. Dressed in male attire for her protection, an act later subjected to condemnation, Joan defied social norms and ventured into a world dominated by men, a world of politics and war. Her arrival at Charles's court in Chinon was a crucial moment, not just in her life but in French history. According to the account of the chronicler Jean de Venette, she spoke with such eloquence and conviction that all who heard her were amazed. At this court, Joan faced skepticism and ridicule, but her determination and, according to some accounts, her ability to recognize Charles among his courtiers, despite never having met him, convinced the Dauphin and his followers of her divine mission. Armed with a white banner bearing the image of God and the saints, Joan prepared for battle, not only as a visionary, but as a leader on the battlefield. In the words of historian Stephen Ritchie, Joan appeared at the court like a ray of hope, an antidote against the despair that had suffocated French morale. The young peasant, with a determination that eclipsed her youth, convinced Charles and his most skeptical advisors of her divine mission, to liberate Orleans and crown Charles as King of France. In the spring of 1429, Joan led a French army, not as a figurehead, but as a leader in the true sense of the word. The situation in Orleans was desperate. The city, a vital bastion for France, was besieged by English forces. The chronicler Jean Froissart, a witness to those times, wrote, "The Maid of Orleans not only inspired the French with her presence, but guided them with a cunning and courage that belied her age and experience." In the spring of 1429, the situation in Orleans was critical. The city, strategically crucial, was besieged by the English army, which had built a series of fortifications around the city to cut it off from the rest of France. The arrival of Joan of Arc, commanding the French army, marked a radical shift in the dynamics of the siege. The attacks led by Joan were bold in both planning and execution. The first significant move was a direct and surprise assault on the Saint-Lô fortress, one of the English's key strategic positions. This attack, carried out on the 4th of May, was a resounding success. Joan and her troops managed to capture the fortress, a feat that not only stunned the English with its audacity, but also revitalized the spirit of those besieged in Orleans. The next notable action was 2 days later, on the 6th of May, when Joan led an attack against another English fortress, Saint-Jean-le-Blanc, which had been recently abandoned by the English. Despite the English regrouping at the nearby St. Augustine's fortress, Joan and her forces did not stop. They launched a frontal assault on this position, achieving a crucial victory that further crumbled the English siege ring around the city. The final blow was dealt the following day, the 7th of May, in what would be considered the most critical battle of the siege. The attack on Les Tourelles, the fort controlling the bridge over the Loire River, and therefore, access to the city. In this battle, Joan displayed her leadership and bravery spectacularly. Despite being wounded by an arrow, she refused to leave the battlefield, insisting on staying at the front line. Her tenacity and courage inspired the French troops to fight with renewed fervor, culminating in the capture of Les Tourelles after fierce combat. These attacks, carried out in rapid succession, surprised the English not only for their boldness and aggression, but also because they challenged the perceived capacity of the French military at that time. Under Joan's leadership, the French army, previously demoralized and retreating, transformed into a cohesive and combative force. As noted by contemporary chronicler Jean de Venette, the English were astonished, their hearts fell, and their bravery dissipated in the face of Joan's determination and her army. The fall of Les Tourelles and the lifting of the siege were celebrated not only in Orléans, but throughout France. The victory was unexpected. The French had been in constant retreat, and the arrival of a young peasant girl claiming to be sent by God to save France seemed little more than a fable. However, Joan proved to be the catalyst for a radical change. As highlighted by contemporary chronicler Jean Chartier, Joan's arrival in Orleans was like the appearance of a guardian angel for the French. The liberation of Orléans was not just a military victory for France, it was a symbol of resistance and hope. Joan's leadership, her unwavering faith, and her courage on the battlefield reversed the course of the 100 Years' War and elevated her status to a heroic and almost mythical figure in French history. Modern historians, such as Kelly de Vries, have noted that Joan's impact on French morale was as significant as her tactical achievements. De Vries observes, Joan transformed the war not only with her direct participation in the battlefield, but also by elevating the spirit of a downtrodden people. The capture of Joan of Arc and her subsequent trial in Rouen constitute a dark and complex episode in the history of the 100 Years' War, one that extends beyond the battlefield into the murky intricacies of the politics and religion of the time. Her trial for heresy was not just a matter of faith and orthodoxy, but a game of power and manipulation, where the life of a young peasant girl became the center of a struggle between nations and creeds. Joan's capture occurred on the 23rd of May, 1430 in Compiègne, while defending the city against an attack by Burgundian forces, allies of the English. Her fall into enemy hands marked the beginning of the end of her brief but impactful military career. The circumstances of her capture have been the subject of debate and interpretation over the years, with some historians suggesting she was abandoned by her own troops, while others argue that it was simply the result of the confusion and chaos of combat. Some historians, based on witness accounts and documents of the time, suggest that Joan was abandoned on the battlefield by her own troops. This theory holds that during the frantic retreat of the French forces towards the safety of Compiègne's walls, the drawbridge was prematurely closed, leaving Joan and a small group of soldiers outside the walls and at the mercy of the enemy. This act could be interpreted as a deliberate abandonment, possibly motivated by distrust or disloyalty of some French commanders toward Joan, whose influence and status were viewed with suspicion and envy by certain sectors of the French nobility. On the other hand, another interpretation suggests that Joan's capture was the result of the confusion and chaos inherent in combat, According to this view, the closure of the drawbridge and the subsequent capture of Joan were not acts of betrayal or abandonment, but unfortunate consequences of the disorder of the battlefield. Amidst the tumult, with the Burgundian forces pressing heavily, the closing of the bridge may have been a hasty decision to protect the city, without enough time to ensure the safe retreat of all the combatants, including Joan. The narrative of Joan's capture in Compiègne, therefore, intertwines with themes of loyalty, betrayal, and the brutal reality of medieval warfare. The young woman who had defied expectations and led France to several victories suddenly found herself in a situation of vulnerability and danger. After her capture, Joan was handed over to the English, who took her to Rouen for trial. Joan of Arc's trial for heresy was a proceeding charged with political and ecclesiastical tensions. As historian George Duby notes, Joan's trial was more a political act than a sincere search for theological truth. Under the direction of Bishop Pierre Cochon, a loyal supporter of the English, the trial sought not only to condemn Joan but also to delegitimize the cause of the Dauphin Charles by proving that his coronation in Reims had been sponsored by a heretic. The trial took place in an atmosphere of intense pressure and coercion. Joan was interrogated on a variety of topics, from her wearing of male clothing to her claims of receiving divine visions and messages from saints. Despite being alone, without legal counsel, and facing a hostile tribunal, Joan remained steadfast in her responses. She showed a cunning and acumen that surprised her accusers and those who witnessed the trial. As noted by contemporary chronicler Jean Chartier, her wit was such that she often left her judges perplexed and embarrassed. Joan of Arc's trial in Rouen, more than a mere legal procedure, was an intellectual and spiritual duel, where a young peasant girl faced off against an assembly of experienced theologians and jurists. The trial was a mix of theology, law, and politics. The accusations of heresy and witchcraft had profound implications, and the tribunal sought not only to condemn Joan, but also to discredit her victories, and by extension, the legitimacy of Charles VII. The tribunal, seeking to trap Joan in heresy, posed deeply complex theological questions, hoping her lack of formal education would lead her to contradictions or heretical statements. However, Joan, guided by her faith and sharp common sense, responded with a clarity and precision that baffled her accusers. For example, when asked if she knew if she was in God's grace, Joan replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God keep me there." This response, both humble and cleverly evasive, frustrated her judges, who hoped to trap her in a theological dilemma. One of the central points of the trial was her choice to wear male clothing, an act considered inappropriate and challenging to the gender norms of the time. Joan defended this choice not only as a practical necessity on the battlefield and for protection in a male-dominated environment, but also as part of her divine mission. This defense baffled her accusers, as it challenged social and ecclesiastical conventions without falling into heresy. Despite intense scrutiny and accusations of hallucinations or diabolical deceits, Joan remained firm in her account of the divine visions and messages she had received. Her ability to describe these experiences with consistency and detail, and her unwavering affirmation that they were sent by God, left little room for her accusers to prove they were fabrications or deceits. Throughout the trial, Joan faced intimidation tactics and threats of torture. She was subjected to prolonged and exhausting interrogation sessions, often conducted by multiple inquisitors simultaneously. These sessions sought to disorient and pressure her to contradict herself or reveal any weakness in her statements. The inquisitors asked leading questions and often repeated the same queries in different ways, in an attempt to catch her in errors or inconsistencies. During the trial, Joan was isolated and kept in particularly harsh imprisonment conditions. She was in a dark, damp cell, with severe restrictions on her mobility and limited access to religious assistance or external support. This isolation sought to weaken her physical and emotional resistance, making her more susceptible to pressure during interrogations. One of the most insidious tactics used against Joan was the threat of physical torture. On several occasions, she was shown torture instruments or taken to the torture chamber, hinting at what she could expect if she did not cooperate. Although there is no evidence that Joan was physically tortured, the mere threat and demonstration of these instruments were enough to instill fear. However, Joan maintained her resolve, refusing to succumb to these intimidations. The tribunal also employed psychological manipulation tactics. They attempted to confuse and discredit her divine visions and voices, suggesting they were fabrications or deceits of the devil. They aggressively questioned her about her faith and mystical experiences, trying to portray her as a blasphemer or madwoman. The trial reached its climax when Joan was finally condemned for heresy and sentenced to the stake. On the 29th of May, 1431, in the Old Market Square of Rouen, Joan of Arc was burned alive, an act that became one of the most infamous and emotionally charged moments in medieval history. Joan's execution, far from being a mere act of religious justice, was a clear political message from the English to France and any supporter of Charles VII. Joan of Arc's execution, which occurred on the 30th of May, 1431 in Rouen, Normandy, is one of the most somber and remembered moments in medieval history. The method of execution, burning at the stake, is extremely cruel and painful. The stake was prepared with wood, piled to create a solid base, and reinforced with more combustible materials like straw or dry branches to ensure the fire spread quickly and intensely. The temperature of the fire could reach between 600 and 1000 degrees Celsius. These high temperatures caused severe and rapid damage to her tissues. To prevent Joan of Arc from freeing herself, she was tied with ropes interlaced with chains. Executioners often used methods to ensure that the ropes burned slowly or were placed in such a way that even if they burned, the prisoner would not have the capacity to free themselves due to the intensity of the fire and the physical weakening caused by the heat and smoke. The duration of Joan of Arc's suffering at the stake is considered to have been very high. There are no exact records of the time it took for Joan of Arc to die, but generally, death at the stake can occur in a few minutes or can take up to half an hour or more. Loss of consciousness due to the inhalation of smoke and toxic gases usually occurs before death from burns. The execution of Joan of Arc, and any death at the stake, is a reminder of the brutal practices of the medieval era and how these practices were used to punish and terrorize. Her execution was particularly notable due to her young age, her bravery, and her steadfastness in her beliefs until the end. Her death became a symbol of resistance and faith, and over time, her figure was rehabilitated and canonized, becoming a saint for the Catholic Church. The image of Joan at the stake has endured in collective memory as a potent reminder of the era's brutality and the strength of the human spirit in the face of adversity. Joan's death was not the end, but the beginning of her immortality. Transformed from a historical figure to a symbol of resistance and sanctity, her legacy continues to inspire generations. Since her execution in 1431, the figure of Joan of Arc has transcended the confines of history to become a cultural and spiritual icon. In the 19th century, Joan was rediscovered as a symbol of French nationalism. Historians like Jules Michelet saw her not only as a heroine of France, but as a personification of the nation itself. Michelet wrote, "She is France, the simple and strong France, that loves and suffers." This view highlighted Joan's role as a unifying and liberating figure at a time when France sought to reaffirm its identity after the upheavals of the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. In the 20th century, the veneration of Joan of Arc took on a more spiritual aspect, with her canonization by the Catholic Church in 1920. Pope Benedict XV described her as a martyr of faith, emphasizing her religious devotion and role as a spiritual guide. The canonization was recognition not only of her piety, but also of her role as a role model in terms of bravery and moral conviction. In art and culture, Joan has been portrayed in countless ways. From the romantic depictions of painters like Jules Bastien Lepage to her portrayal in plays and films, each representation reflects the concerns and aspirations of its time. In cinema, films like The Passion of Joan of Arc by Carl Theodor Dreyer and Joan of Arc by Luc Besson have presented very different but equally powerful interpretations of her story. Moreover, Joan has been a recurring theme in literature, from the works of William Shakespeare to those of George Bernard Shaw. Each has interpreted her story through the prism of their context, reflecting the varied facets of her legacy. In the political realm, Joan has been embraced by movements of various ideologies. During World War II, both Vichy France and the French resistance invoked her as a symbol of struggle and national sovereignty. This demonstrates how her figure can be molded to serve different causes, sometimes even opposing ones. Finally, the story of Joan of Arc remains a powerful reminder of the complexity of history and how historical figures can be reinterpreted over time. Her legacy, far from being a unidimensional tale, is a rich and multifaceted tapestry reflecting humanity's aspirations, struggles, and hopes. In the words of historian Stephen Ritchie, Joan of Arc is one of those rare figures that continues to inspire and challenge each generation, inviting us to reflect on our own beliefs and the world in which we live. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life and legacy of Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans. Her story, intertwining faith, valor, and tragedy, continues to resonate in our present, reminding us of the power of the human spirit in the face of adversity. Through the pages of history, Joan stands as a beacon of inspiration and a reminder that even in the darkest times, the light of hope never completely extinguishes. Don't forget to subscribe to discover more stories that have defined our world. Stories of valor, sacrifice, and resilience that continue to forge our understanding of humanity and its relentless quest for meaning and justice. Now, I would like to know your opinion. Do you believe Joan of Arc was truly guided by divine visions, or were her actions more driven by her historical context and exceptional personality? Please leave your comment below, share your thoughts, and be part of this fascinating conversation. Do you know about the terrible accidents of the space race? The dark truth behind the moon's conquest is extensive and complicated. Click on yes and discover them.